happened in the fall of 2021. I was 23 at the time and living in a small town in northern Oregon, the kind of place where you could drive 10 minutes in any direction and be surrounded by nothing but trees. I'd lived there my whole life, so the woods were never something that scared me. That's important to understand, because what happened that night changed that completely. My buddy Garrett had been pushing the idea of a camping trip for weeks. He was one of those guys who couldn't sit still, always needed something to do, somewhere to go. He was 24 and worked at a lumber yard in town. Physically, he was built like someone who could handle himself in any situation, which made what happened later even more unsettling because I'd never seen him scared before that night. The other two were Devin and Marcus. Devin was 22 and had been friends with Garrett since middle school. Quiet guy, but solid. Marcus was the youngest at 20, and honestly, he was only there because Devin invited him. Last minute. I didn't know him that well, but he seemed cool enough. Garrett picked a spot he said he'd been to before. It was deep in the Tillamook State Forest, way off the main trails. He said there was a clearing about a 2-hour hike from where you could park, and that it was perfect for a fire and tents. I didn't question it. Garrett knew those woods better than anyone I knew. We drove out Friday afternoon and parked at a gravel pull-off around 4:30. The hike-in was fine, long and tiring, but nothing unusual. We set up camp right before sundown and got a fire going. The first couple hours were exactly what you'd want from a camping trip. We were drinking beers, talking trash, and just being idiots in the woods. Everything was normal. It was around 11 o'clock when things started feeling different. Marcus was the first one to say something. He was sitting on the far side of the fire, facing the tree line, and he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and just stared past us into the dark. We all turned around and obviously saw nothing. He said he thought he saw someone standing between the trees. Garrett told him to relax and that it was probably a deer. Marcus laughed it off, but I noticed he kept glancing in that direction after that. About 20 minutes later, I heard something that didn't sit right with me. It was a branch snapping somewhere out in the dark, but it wasn't quick like an animal stepping on it. It was slow, like weight was being applied to it gradually until it broke. That's not how animals move. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the paranoid one. Then Devin heard it too. He looked at me, and I could tell from his face he was thinking the same thing. He asked Garrett if there were other campers in the area, and Garrett said no. He said barely anyone comes out this far. That didn't make me feel better. For a while, nothing else happened, and I started convincing myself we were all just on edge, because it was dark and quiet and our brains were filling in the gaps. That's what I told myself. Around midnight, Garrett and Devin went to take a leak somewhere past the tents. Marcus and I stayed by the fire. That's when Marcus grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line to our left. He whispered that something was standing there. I looked, and at first, I didn't see anything. It was just black between the trunks. But then I realized one of the shapes wasn't a tree. It was taller and narrower, and it wasn't swaying with the wind like everything else was. It was perfectly still. I stared at it for what felt like a full minute, trying to make sense of it, and then it moved. Not like a person walking. It sort of shifted to the side in one fluid motion, like it slid from one spot to another without taking a step. There was no sound, no rustling, nothing. Just this dark shape gliding between the trees and then stopping again. I felt every hair on my body stand up. Marcus stood up and back toward the tents. I couldn't move. I just kept staring at where it had been and where it was now. It was closer. Not by a lot, but enough that I could tell whatever it was had moved toward us. Garrett and Devin came back, and immediately could tell something was wrong. I told Garrett what we saw, and he looked toward the tree line and said he didn't see anything. I looked again, and he was right. It was gone. Marcus backed me up and said he saw it too, but Garrett just shook his head and said it was probably a shadow from the fire playing tricks on us. I wanted to believe him. We all sat back down, but nobody was really talking anymore. The mood was completely different. The fire was getting low, and Garrett threw a couple more logs on. That's when we heard something that none of us could explain away. It was a voice. It came from somewhere deep in the trees to our right. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't whispering. It was just talking. A flat, monotone voice saying something we couldn't quite make out. It sounded like a man, but the rhythm of it was wrong. The pauses between words were too long and too even, like someone reading off a script they didn't understand. Devin said, "What the hell is that?" Nobody answered. It kept going for about 30 seconds and then just stopped. Dead silence. Even the insects had gone quiet, which was something I hadn't noticed until right then. That silence was worse than the voice. Garrett finally said we should pack up and leave. That was all I needed to hear. If Garrett wanted to leave, then it was serious. We started pulling the tents down as fast as we could. Marcus was shaking. I could see his hands trembling while he was trying to roll up his sleeping bag. I wasn't doing much better. We got everything packed in probably 5 minutes and started hiking back toward the car. Garrett had his phone flashlight on, and I had mine. Devin and Marcus stayed between us. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were our footsteps and our breathing. About 15 minutes into the hike, I looked over my shoulder and saw something between the trees, maybe 40 or 50 feet behind us. It was the same shape from earlier, tall and dark and completely still. But this time, I could see just a little more detail from the flashlight catching it at an angle. It looked like a person, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long. The way it stood didn't look like how a person stands. It was slightly hunched forward, with its arms hanging way past where they should have. I told everyone to walk faster. I didn't explain why. I didn't want to. We picked up the pace, and I kept checking behind us every 30 seconds or so. Sometimes I saw it, sometimes I didn't, but it was always closer than the last time I'd seen it. Then Marcus tripped on a root and went down hard. We stopped to help him up, and that's when Devin looked behind us and saw it too. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed Marcus by the arm and yanked him to his feet and said, "Run." We ran, all 4 of us sprinting through the woods in the dark with nothing but phone flashlights. Branches were hitting my face, and I could barely see the ground in front of me, but I didn't care. Behind us, I could hear something moving through the trees. Not footsteps. It was more like a rushing sound, like something dragging through the brush at a speed that didn't make sense. Garrett was ahead of me, and he suddenly yelled that he could see the road. We broke through the last stretch of trees and hit the gravel pull-off. Everyone was gasping and bent over trying to breathe. I turned around and pointed my flashlight back into the woods. There was nothing there, just trees and darkness and complete silence. We threw everything into the truck, and Garrett drove out of there faster than I've ever seen him drive. Nobody said anything for the entire ride home. When we got back to town and were sitting in Garrett's driveway, he looked at me and said he saw it too when we were running. He said it was right behind us on the trail and that it stopped the second we hit the road, like it couldn't leave the trees or just didn't want to. We never talked about it as a group after that. Devin brought it up once a few weeks later, and Garrett shut it down. Marcus moved out of state the following year, and I honestly don't know if it was related, but I never asked. I still live in the same town. I still see those woods every day on my drive to work. I don't go in them anymore. Not at night, not during the day. I know how that sounds, but I don't care. Whatever was out there that night was real. All 4 of us saw it or heard it in some way. I don't have an explanation for it, and I've stopped trying to find one. Some things just don't have one. This happened about 3 years ago when I was 20. I lived in a college town in rural Virginia at the time. My roommate Jake and I had this thing where every few weekends we'd go night hiking on the trails near campus. It sounds stupid, and honestly, it probably was, but we'd been doing it since freshman year, and nothing had ever gone wrong, so we never really questioned it. Jake was the kind of guy who was afraid of absolutely nothing. He grew up on a farm outside of Roanoke and had been in the woods his entire life. I trusted him completely when it came to stuff like that, which is probably why I never hesitated when he suggested we try a new trail that night. It was a Saturday in late October. We drove about 40 minutes to a trailhead neither of us had been to before. Jake found it on some hiking forum. It was a 6-mile loop through dense forest that supposedly had a creek crossing and some old foundations from a settlement that had been abandoned decades ago. We got there around 9:30 at night. There were no other cars in the lot. The first mile or so was fine. The trail was narrow but easy to follow with our headlamps. The woods were thick on both sides, and the only sounds were our footsteps and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the leaves. Normal stuff. About 30 minutes in, we hit the creek. It was shallow enough to cross on rocks without getting our boots wet. On the other side, the trail curved left, and the trees got noticeably denser. The canopy was so thick overhead that even the moonlight couldn't get through. It was the darkest stretch of woods I'd ever been in. That's when Jake stopped walking. He held his hand up, and I stopped behind him. He turned off his headlamp and told me to do the same. I did. We just stood there in complete darkness and listened. Somewhere ahead of us on the trail there was a sound. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but not quite. The timing was off. It was like someone taking a step and then dragging. Something before taking another step. Step, drag, step, drag. And it was getting closer. Jake whispered that it was probably an animal. I wanted to agree with him, but animals don't move like that. That sound was deliberate. Whatever was making it was walking on two legs. We stood there frozen for maybe 30 seconds, and then it stopped. Just like that. Complete silence. No insects, no wind, nothing. Jake turned his headlamp back on and pointed it down the trail. The beam only reached maybe 40 feet before the trail curved out of sight. There was nothing there. He looked at me and said, "Let's keep going." I didn't want to, but I also didn't want to stand still in the dark, so I followed him. We made it maybe another quarter mile before I saw something that I still can't explain. There was a figure standing just off the trail to our right. It was maybe 15 feet away between two trees. At first, I thought it was a person, but something about it was deeply wrong. It was too tall, not like a tall person. It was stretched out in a way that didn't look human. Its arms hung down past its knees, and its head was tilted at an angle that would have been painful for a normal person. It was completely motionless. I grabbed Jake's arm and pointed. The second his headlamp hit it, I expected it to move or run or do something. It didn't. It just stood there. I could see now that it was dark all over, not like clothing, like its surface was just black. There were no features I could make out, no face, no texture, just a shape that looked like a person but wasn't. Jake said we need to go, right now. His voice was different. That was the first and only time I ever heard fear in it. We turned around and started walking fast back the way we came. I kept looking over my shoulder, and every time I did, the thing was still standing in the same spot, getting smaller as we moved away. Then on maybe the fourth or fifth time I looked back, it was gone. I told Jake it moved, and he said, "Don't look." Back again, just walk. We practically jogged the rest of the way. When we crossed the creek, I slipped and soaked my entire right leg, but I didn't care. We didn't stop until we were back at the car. Jake started the engine before I even had my door fully closed. On the drive back, he didn't say much. I asked him what he thought it was, and he just shook his head. He said he didn't know, and that he didn't want to think about it right now. That was the last time we ever went night hiking. We talked about it once more a few days later. He admitted that when his headlamp first hit it, he could tell it wasn't a person. He said the shape was wrong in a way he couldn't describe, and that standing near it made him feel something he'd never felt before, like a heaviness in his chest. I felt the same thing, but hadn't been able to put it into words until he said that. I don't tell people this story often because I know how it sounds, but Jake and I both saw the same thing, and we were completely sober. Whatever it was real, and it was standing in those woods like it had been waiting there.